been 17.
I am a vampire, and you are mortal.
Hello and welcome to This Podcast Sucks.
The show where we take a bite out of the vampire genre.
We'll be following all manner of fanged fiends through the past 127 years of film and television.
From Nosferatu to Twilight, I'm your host, Tara.
And I'm your host, Elliot.
And today we will be talking about Frank R. Strayer's 1935 film, Condemned to Live, which I am excited to get into because I think, like you were saying, Elliot, this is the first film we've disagreed on.
Yes.
So I did not care for it really at all. And I know you said you liked it.
Yeah, last night you texted me and you were like, this is a terrible movie.
I think I was just like, wow, this movie is bad. And I thought it was the worst one we've watched so far, but you don't think that?
Yeah, I think, I don't think this was the best one we've watched so far, but I found myself engaged by this one in a way that I definitely was not for, our last film was Mark of the Vampire, and that one I was engaged because there was like a level of absurdism to it, but like the Vampire Bat, I really struggled to pay attention to. And then, even Lugosi's Dracula had some issues in terms of like keeping audience engagement up and just like the pacing, but there were things that I liked about this film and things that I thought were innovative.
That's so interesting because I think this was my Vampire Bat. I think I like, maybe it's because with the Vampire Bat there was like that twist with the mad scientist trope or something. I don't know, but this one I was struggling with this one a bit to just stay focused, but that's all stuff we can get into and discuss. But first, I should talk about the film's production and some background. Granted, there's not a lot I could find, but the film was directed by Frank R. Strayer, who from my internet research, I guess, or what little internet research I did, he's considered a prevalent horror director within Hollywood. I guess he made a lot of horror films around this time. The film was written by a woman, Karen DeWolf, which I think we were saying she might be the first solo female writer we've had for our films.
Woohoo! Yes, we have had scarce women kind of at the production level, at like the kind of higher production level.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so the music was by Abe Meyer, produced by Mary M. Cohen, and apparently it was produced independently of the Hollywood studio system, which is interesting. So I would have to imagine that Maury Cohen here had a lot of money, could bankroll this. kind of like Vampire, where the producer for that was also like, I'll produce it if you cast me as the lead.
Yes, that guy, the dandy almost like, wasn't he friends with Oscar Wilde, or didn't he have an affair with Oscar Wilde's wife? He had some really interesting connection to Oscar Wilde.
He had a very interesting life and was most well known for, I think, starting famous fashion magazines. Like, I want to say Vogue was one. I
think he
and
was
for kind of befriending or starting the careers of some famous fashion designers. That was his true domain. So yeah. And let's see, release, unfortunately could not find much about it. But in terms of fun facts, because Frank R. Strayer also directed The Vampire Bat, which he was able to use sets from The Bride of Frankenstein for. This film also did the same, but with the Vampire Bat. So Frank R. Strayer used the same music and sets as the Vampire Bat, which, the sets were really Bride of Frankenstein. So we're getting into Inception levels of set usage, I would say. And It also reused some costumes from Bride of Frankenstein. And the film was first telecast on July 8th, 1941 on New York City's newly launched first full-time television station, WNBD Channel 1, which had previously been identified as W2XBS during its preceding experimental years. So post-World War II televiewers got their first look at it in New York City Wednesday the 10th, November 1948 on WATV Channel 13.
1948?
Yes.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So 13 years after the film was made?
Well, it says it was first telecast on 1941.
Okay.
In New York City's newly launched first full-time television station.
Oh, this was the first time a film,
during its preceding experimental years. Post-World War II televiewers, this says, got their first look at it in New York City in November 1948 on WATV Channel 13. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And then in terms of legacy, it's also kind of considered an outlier and sort of progressive for its time for being an early vampire film that depicts it in a sympathetic way, which I think is interesting and all stuff we can get into. So, should we start by discussing the film?
Yes, for sure. I think I agree that that's like the big innovation that I noticed in the film. And it's also cool that this is our first connection to television. Yeah,
no, that is interesting. And I wonder what it was about this film that was picked for that. But
yeah, that's a great question. But yeah, let's get into the story.
So the film opens with a trio of explorers in Africa who are hiding in a cave, and one of the explorers is a pregnant woman who apparently has been bitten by a vampire bat. And during the scene, I think I was very confused with what was going on.
Yeah.
I was just, I think in my notes I say, okay, we're in a cave. What are those drums? This woman is clearly dying of something.
Yeah.
And then, we get our 1930s white colonialist, don't worry, darling, the natives won't attack us here. No, boy.
Yeah, and she's scared of the drums. She says, like, always with the drums, like, complaining about them. And I did not realize that this scene was set in Africa. I thought that this was...
I didn't either.
Yeah, I thought this was the same cave that comes up later in the movie. So I was very confused.
Yeah, it probably was the same set, for the cave. But it's like you were saying, we're still in this kind of early stage of filmmaking where we just don't have a lot of things like establishing shots or contextualization of where things take place. We kind of just jump right into the plot. And that can make it very confusing, as we were saying. But, the two characters, the two men in the scene, kind of establish what's going on. This woman is pregnant and dying. She has been bitten by a vampire bat, which, I'm just going to say it. I think Frank R. Strayer is really into the concept of bats and vampirism.
He does seem particularly like his two films have had a strong bat presence. Bats are in the room with us.
There's so many flappy bats, you see the flappy bat come down on her, and it's interesting how I think now bats are pretty much not a thing when it comes to our like, you don't need a bat in our vampire media, unless it's What We Do in the Shadows, where it's played for laughs and they're like, wow, bat fight.
Or Renfield has some bat moments.
That's true, but I think that's interesting because Renfield is about, his relationship with Dracula, who's this very long-standing iconic figure. I feel like the bat iconography is more closely attached to like an older idea of vampires or vampirism.
Definitely.
Which is neat. So the film cuts forward in time to a small European village, a village that looks very familiar. Have we seen it in some films, maybe? Where, lo and behold, a series of mysterious murders are taking place, and the villagers start to assemble in mob form with torches at the house of Professor Kristen after every murder. So the film then cuts forward in time to a small European village, a village that looks very familiar, I would say, where a series of mysterious murders are taking place. So in these scenes, we see the villagers begin to assemble in mob form. They've got their torches, consistently at the house of Professor Kristen, played by Ralph Morgan, after every murder. So while you were watching this, Elliot, were you becoming strongly reminded of the vampire bat? Could we see the director's stamp?
That's interesting because I hadn't really thought of it that way. But when you pointing it out, I guess there is that similarity. I did have in my notes several times that I was like, why is everyone so obsessed with Professor Kristen? Like, what is so special about this guy? Like, how, like, everyone is, like, in love with him. Everyone is, like, ride or die for this dude. And they call him Professor, but he doesn't seem to do any teaching, or it seems like they just call him that because he's really smart and knows about a lot of different things.
Yeah, I think, well, they kept calling him Professor, but I'm just based on what he was doing in the film, I was just thinking of him as a doctor, because he's like examining dead bodies and things like that. But, you know, why not just call him doctor? Maybe he's not. Maybe he's just the smartest guy, and they're like, what's going on?
There is a character that they call doctor, that, like, there is another character that's a doctor. So, yeah.
That comes in later. So it's a little, I don't know, professor, doctor, same thing then, maybe. I should. But yeah, because we get, I think I have in my notes, this film feels aesthetically similar to the vampire bat. Yeah, I said this film is starting to feel very aesthetically similar to the vampire bat, like with the scene where they're examining the body. And it's like in these films, there's always a crowd around a body that has been drained of blood, you know? And it's like, can we just
what is everyone doing there?
Because it's like, well, we can't have our mob of villagers if they're just kept in the dark about what's going on, which is what would happen if you did a private autopsy, you know, like in real life. So,
and it doesn't really even seem like an autopsy. It's like they get the corpse on the table and then they look at the neck and they're like, well, that's all the information we need.
I mean, I'm glad that, you know, basic logic is being used here, because you see two holes in a dead person's neck. You can reasonably assume they have lost blood in some capacity. In other movies, they're like, what are you talking about? When they say it's like a vampire, they're like, well, they've been drained of blood. I'm like, you know, the neck holes have to mean something. So.
Yeah, but it is interesting, the idea that, like, you wouldn't do any further investigating at all of, like, well, do they have bruises, or, like, are there other injuries to the body?
Yeah.
They're just like, well, case closed.
Yeah, case closed. So in the movie, the villagers suspect that a giant bat is to blame for the murders. The professor, Kristen, gives the villagers advice on staying safe and assures them that a scientific explanation exists. So yeah, we see that scene with him on his balcony, just being like, stay inside, you know, have a bunch of light. That is, you know, you're safe that way. We also get a bit of his home life, where we find out that he is engaged to his fiancée Marguerite, played by Maxine Doyle, and that I think, what do I have in my notes? Hold on. I think I wrote, the first time we see her, I say, okay, based on Little Bo Peep's dress, what time period are we in?
Yes, her introduction is interesting because she looks very childish. Like, she kind of skips into, she's like skipping up to the building, and she kind of skips in, and she has this basket with this stuff in it. Like, it's very, it's like
kind of
you would not think.
Infantilized.
Yeah, absolutely. And she continues to be dressed in a way that can be kind of interpreted pretty childishly. They also, like, her fiance calls her child all the time.
They all do. All the men call her child.
Yeah, everyone calls her child.
Yes. No, I think that's a good point. I think the costumers were trying to make her look younger, because I could be wrong, but an actress clearly in her 20s. But I think her character is supposed to be like a teenager. So when they're talking about her engagement, I just wrote, what is the age difference here?
At least 20 years, just based on how he looks, right?
Yeah. And so she is kind of framed as this beautiful, kind, innocent, young girl, young woman, that everyone just adores and loves because of those traits. She, it becomes apparent, is a little hesitant about marrying the professor because he, in this village, is so revered. As you were saying, he's so wonderful, so enlightened. Everyone just, is his number one fan. And she's always saying things like, I'm going to be a good wife, and I will be worthy of him. And, very... I
worship him. Or something like
worrying things that would make us go, But yes, so we see that relationship, and we also get an introduction to the character of, I believe it's Zan?
Yes. Also, I just found Marguerite says, could I ever deserve the professor, after like talking about how great he is, which is very like, it's kind of, because you're right that she expresses some hesitance, but because I remembered her saying something kind of very odd during that scene, or so I found that a little weird. But then we, I guess, and another thing about that scene before we talk about Zan that I think in terms of why, some of the reasons that I think this film is a bit better than some of the other ones I've watched, is that this felt like there was a bit of connective tissue here, where like we learn a bit about Marguerite, and his I think it's his cook is talking about the professor, and she talks a bit about like all of the different things that he does for the townspeople, and that he stays up all hours of the night reading and writing and helping people, and that he's so selfless. So that felt like we were getting a bit of some backstory and a bit of kind of development of who these people are, which I appreciated.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. There was plenty of context, I guess, given to why everyone loves the professor so much. And everything he does. And in the scene where he's talking with Marguerite, we're introduced to Zahn, played by Misha Aur. Maybe that's how he's a Russian-born American actor, so I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But yeah, here again, just seeing the parallels with the vampire bat, because his character function, as we'll see later on in the film, is very similar to Dwight Frye's, as he becomes kind of the scapegoat for the town, very much so because of ableism. Marguerite herself is like vocal about how his physical appearance frightens her, but to the professor's credit, he's like, hey, don't say that. The professor speaks to his character and inner beauty and all that, so the professor is woke. And
yes, yeah.
But then he says that incredibly strange line where he says, where is it? She says, like, she's voicing her, how she's put off by him and everything. He's like speaking up for him. And she says he's grateful to you because the professor kind of takes him in and is good to him. And the professor says, gratitude is beauty. And I just write, what?
It is a very, it's a very weird statement. And it is sort of, there is this implication that, one of the reasons that Professor Kristen is so great is that he's the only person that could ever take pity on like an abject figure like Zan, which I don't really love. And then they have and then he says some weird kind of patronizing stuff, like the gratitude is beauty thing he says, but there's also some other weird, like there's a couple other kind of strange things that he says.
Yeah, he does say some, like you said, some patronizing stuff, and it's like, Karen, no, the writer. It's like, but
Karen, no.
Reflection of the time, I guess. So we also see that Marguerite has another. I don't know if lover is the right term, but there's, what's his name, David?
There's David. David, yeah.
David's in the picture, played by Russell Gleason.
He's a sweetie.
He's her sweetie. You know what? I think I have in my notes as well. I like at one point I write so this is the scene where I don't know, they have a few scenes together that are basically the same, where he's just like, don't marry the professor, and she's like, but he's so good, and I do like worship him or whatever. And I write down here, David says, you respect and admire him and even revere him, but that's not love. And I just write, damn, David is right.
Yeah, he is right.
He is right, and he wants to be with Marguerite, and she's just like, no, I mean, if I'm worthy enough for the professor to want to marry, I gotta do it. So
she literally says, I belong to Professor Kristen. She doesn't even use his first name. His name is Paul. And
he keeps trying to get her to say Paul.
And she doesn't do it.
Yeah, there's a total massive power kind of differentiation here. That again probably would not have been as big a deal in 1935, but now it's kind of given the ick a little bit, even though like the professor's a good guy. Like, it's just, again, the age gap, the differences in background, in experience, all of that, and how they see each other. It's no thanks.
And David and Marguerite have a lot more in common aside from genuine love for each other. They went to school together. They've known each other their whole lives. Like, it is kind of, and Professor Kristen is like this person that she presumably has not known very long, and that she was betrothed to by her father. So there's all sorts of reasons that, you're right, there is something a bit icky about the whole thing with the professor. But I this was another thing that I kind of liked, actually, is that this is like a subplot. Like, we're getting a subplot for the first time where there's like competing love interests, and there's like an actual choice that the female protagonist has to make. And that felt pretty cool, that she was not just and I mean, she's not full sexy lamp, but there is some amount of agency in terms of, who is she gonna like get closer to, who is she gonna kind of be with in terms of these two guys. And there's a bit more concern with her feelings, because I think all of the past films that we've covered, it's been pretty much like, there's a woman, she's very devoted and in love with her husband or her fiance, and then she's like in danger, and that's kind of everything that she has going on.
Yes, no, I would absolutely agree with that. Marguerite does have a character in this movie, and these other, kind of male figures in her life do consider her feelings and do recognize the fact that she does have agency. She can say no. She doesn't have to marry the professor if she doesn't love him. And we as the audience know that would probably be okay because the professor's a good guy when he's not drinking blood.
That's a spoiler.
Well, I'm literally going to get to in the next sentence. We find out. But now her, enacting her agency, that's another story. We don't necessarily see that. But I think at this point in the movie, I don't know, the dialogue just feels very kind of, no offense, like, I love that we have a female screenwriter, and that it sounds like she had a very prolific career, or I don't know if prolific is the right term, but, as a female writer in Hollywood in the 1930s, she wrote, for decades. She was blacklisted. She was in this system for a long time, and that's really cool, but the dialogue for me was just kind of clunky and on the nose. I think it was also just how little of a, I don't know, artistic or stylistic stamp this film had.
Yeah.
It's very, I know we gotta get back to the plot, but it's a lot of static, medium long shots, medium close-ups. The camera doesn't move a lot, and there's just a lot of like pauses and dead space.
And I totally, to be honest, I totally agree on the dialogue. There's also just some really poorly like placed or organized dialogue, like in the opening scene. The guy is like, one of them is like, they'll never come to the cave, and the person he's talking to is like, why? And then he says they fear the vampire bats, like they believe that the vampire bats will like, they'll swoop down and attack them and like bite them. And then literally seconds later, that's exactly what happens. We get the first of, I think, 5 off-screen screams where like a woman just screams and everyone comes running. And so it's like they're talking about like, oh, the threat of the vampire bats, and then literally immediately a vampire bat attacks. And then you're right that David and Marguerite have, I think, 3 near identical conversations where he's like, you love me, you shouldn't marry this guy just because he's a good guy. And then she's like, oh, but I belong to him. Like, this is what my father wants. So you're right that there is. And then there's some, and you're right that there's also some really on the nose moments as well. Like David has, I think it's happened at this point, but David has that line where I think that this line has happened, but there's a scene where all the villagers are kind of discussing the murders, and, that they're like, this is a monster. And David's like, use your sense, like, and he says, this is I think that this is probably a man, someone that you would least expect. And I was like, ugh, okay.
But again, David proves right.
David, the secret learned man of the story. Everyone talks about the professor, but David is the one with good sense.
With sense. Yeah, exactly. So we find out that the professor is the one who is the murderer and committing these attacks, and that at night he is seized by these attacks, which are triggered by the darkness, and they transform him into a trance-like state of murderousness. So that's kind of another interesting thing, which we'll get into, which is how vampirism as it affects a human is shown in this movie, which is not really, but again, we'll
not
kind
much
of get
at all. He does have the chronic headaches and the exhaustion.
Yeah, so there's a physical side effect to it. But in terms of, how it transforms him, it really just makes him, grab someone and drink their blood. There's just not much else physically or supernatural wise that changes. So after the professor commits another murder, he awakens from the trance with no memory of his deed, believing himself to just have fainted. This obliviousness is further enabled by the intervention of Zahn, who is the only person that is aware of his condition. Zahn follows the professor when he is in these trances, ensuring that he's not discovered. So, an old friend of the professor, Dr. Bizet, who is played
I think
by...
Bizet?
Bizet?
I think they call him Bizet. Right. Yeah.
I'm Bizet. Oh my god.
That is phonetically how you would assume, but I think they call him Bizet. And yes. Good friend is definitely true, but the first couple times that he gets introduced, this was wild to me. Paul, the professor, is like, "This is my foster father and best friend, Dr. Bizet." And it's like his foster father. They look near identical in age to me, at least. And there's no...
Did he adopt? Yeah.
Yeah.
Did he adopt you when you were 6 and he was 7? Like...
Yeah. It's like, and there's no... He goes into no further detail of what he even means by foster father, which is interesting because, like, even today, I think that something like being a foster child or like growing up in foster care or being adopted, like those are still considered to be pretty private things by a lot of people. Like, mm-hmm. I think that it would be pretty uncommon for someone to, you know, like just to be like, and this is my foster parent. Mm-hmm. And then I mean, it would be interesting to know what the sentiment towards adoption would have been at the time.
Well, I feel like there was maybe just a lot less oversight or I don't know, legal parameters to it. Because I feel like in a lot of older stories, it's just kind of like, she's my ward, or I took them in as a young foundling, and
that's true. Yeah,
it's like, did you sign paperwork for that?
Yeah. I guess there really was it was a bit more of a free for all in terms of like, you could just raise a kid if you access one, I guess. So, Dr. Bizet, friend, daddy, colleague.
Daddy.
Yes, yeah. There's some homoerotic moments in this film, I think.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. We can discuss that.
Yes.
Further along.
I'll always find a way. Life finds a way. Homoeroticism also finds a way.
That's so true. Oh my gosh. And yeah, no, I'm happy that you picked up on that, because maybe my animosity to the film was turning off my ability to read.
You got to a certain point of like, this is bullshit. I refuse to engage. Like,
if I have to have one more scene where they're like, "My child, do you really love the professor?" I will go.
Yeah. There's even multiple moments where people compare Marguerite to flowers, like two identical lines where they're like, "You, Marguerite, are like these flowers." And it's like, what? Like, beautiful, fragile, and, you know, about to die in 3 days?
I was going to say, die young?
Yeah.
I don't know. If I was Marguerite, I would be moving out of this village, trying to find some more interesting guys to be around that aren't comparing me to flowers. But, so, daddy friend, doctor.
Daddy friend, doctor.
Dr. Bizet arrives, and this is where we have our 15th, 100th scene, I think, with Daniel and Marguerite. Daniel saying, "Don't do it. Don't marry him." Marguerite saying, "I'm going to." But then Dr. Bizet, to his credit, like a good bro/dad, talks with Marguerite and kind of susses out that she is not in love with the professor, though she does love and respect him and, you know, is maybe a little too moon-eyed about him. The doctor then talks with the professor and says, you know, she's young, she might not know the difference, but it's clear she really respects you, but that's not the same as being in love. And the professor is just like, "But if she feels this way, why didn't she tell me?" And again, the professor just being very unaware of this like power differential between them. But, you know, good for you, Dr. Bizet. Everyone is now clearly kind of being like, let's not with this marriage. Then Dr. Bizet discloses to Paul, the professor, that his mother had been bitten by a vampire bat. So the audience learns that the pregnant woman that was bitten in the beginning of the film, is in fact the professor's mother.
Mm-hmm.
And that traits of vampirism have likely been passed down to him per Lamarckism? Is that a thing?
Fascinating.
Hold on. I'm looking this up.
You've also just reminded me of like a pretty big plot hole or a pretty big complication is that first scene in the cave, it then says 1 year later, there's a series of murders. And it's like, how could that scene have taken place the day before the professor was born, if then the events of the film take place a year later and he's in his late 40s?
You know, it's already very Bella pregnancy with how the vampirism is passed to the professor. Maybe the professor's also like Renesmee, where he just aged super quickly in the span of 1 year.
Okay, Lamarckism is real. It's a in the sense that it's like it's a real fake idea.
Yeah. Love it.
So, yeah, so it is. Lamarckism, also known as Lamarckian inheritance, is the notion that an organism can pass on to its offspring physical characteristics that the parent organism acquired through use or disuse during its lifetime. It is also called the inheritance of acquired characteristics, or more recently, soft inheritance. So, like the idea that, like, if you, I guess I'm trying to think of an example, like the idea that if you like worked in construction and you went deaf, that your child could like be born deaf because you went deaf during your lifetime. And it's like, that's not like, you don't,
how it works.
Yeah, exactly. But this would have been, I wonder when this was in relation to DNA, because it seems like this would have predated DNA by like 100+ years. When did DNA get invented? Is the autofill. Wow. So that's what Lamarckism is.
Now, the history of DNA and how that was discovered, that's a whole can of worms.
Yeah, also very interesting.
Very interesting.
History. Oh, fascinating. DNA was first isolated by the Swiss physician Friedrich Miescher, who in 1869 discovered a microscopic substance in the pus of discarded surgical bandages. In 1909, Phoebus Levine identified the base, sugar, and phosphate nucleotide unit of RNA. In 1929, Levine identified deoxyribose sugar in thymus nucleic acid, so DNA. So the first time that we found DNA was 1869, but we didn't know what it was then. So that actually, so Lamarckism, the Jean-Baptiste Lamarck lived from 1744 to 1829. So he missed even the notion that DNA was a thing by 40 years.
Interesting.
Yes. But the Wikipedia example is a guy hammering steel, and it says a blacksmith gets strong muscles from his work, ... and his sons inherit those strong muscles. Just a jacked baby, like 6-pack baby comes out of the womb.
Just comes out. Yeah. Oh my god. Oh, that's wild. Well, in the case of this film, Lamarckism is apparently real, and the vampire bat passed the vampirism into the fetus, which was the professor, this who apparently is 1 year old now. So
he ages 40 years in a year.
you know what? This drastically changes the power differential between him and Marguerite. Marguerite is very much his senior now.
Yes,
so.
yeah, she's the one with all the cards.
Oh my gosh. So Dr. Bizet discloses this information, and so Marguerite is at home with her father, and her father was given strict instructions not to let anyone alone with her. But the professor...
Anyone at all. They say it so many times. Anyone!
And just like there's this long pause, and her dad just goes, "I understand, Professor." Yeah.
Yeah.
Narration, it was clear he did not understand. So the professor goes to Marguerite to, basically release, as he says, release her from her engagement. It's like, what a lovely way we used to put being engaged, or the breakup of an engagement is, I release you.
I release you from the bonds of this contract.
Because I remember this is the same in A Christmas Carol, when his fiance breaks up with him. She's like, so I release you, Ebenezer. It's like, Jesus. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
what a funny, I was not expecting A Christmas Carol to be the thing.
No, listen, that's I might put it down for one of my episodes, because it's honestly, no one has watched this version from the 50s, I feel like, with Alistair Sim, and I'm like, this one is great, and it's really dark. It is dark for a 1950s film. I feel like it, I don't know, it taps into the very tragic nature of the story, but again, maybe an episode for another day around Christmas time.
A full year from now.
Year from now, we'll still be in the 60s of vampire films, probably.
I wonder if there are any Christmas vampire movies.
Oh, surely there are. That has to be a thing. Oh wow.
I mean, yeah, we can look into it. Yeah, I think a Valentine's Day vampire movie that could be that could be interesting, nice and saucy.
I would love that. Well, it's not vampires, but I am going to see Lisa Frankenstein this weekend, so.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, that's in the same, that's cousins, sisters.
It's cousins. No, like I'm saying, at some point we'll have to review the absolutely wild Kenneth Branagh Frankenstein adaptation, which was meant to capitalize on the Bram Stoker Dracula that came out in 92, I think. But no, that movie is wild. Kenneth Branagh was given all the choices and he made them.
Every single one.
Every single one.
He is a fascinating figure. He's a really interesting guy. I actually really liked his version of Hamlet. It was very beautiful.
I've seen scenes of it, but I appreciate his desire to bring a lot of Shakespeare to the big screen in his very kind of stylistic way, and and I also I really enjoy his. I know some people don't, but I really enjoy his Hercule Poirot films.
Oh, I haven't seen any of them actually.
Yeah, I mean, my partner, he's been reading the books, and I mean, those films kind of have a special place in my heart. We saw Death on the Nile for a third date, and then we watched Murder on the Orient Express after that. So anyway, we see those movies a lot, but I enjoy them.
Those are Agatha Christie adaptations, right? Yeah.
Yes, they are. So
cool.
He's a big adapter.
Yeah, he is. I think that's one of the things that's interesting about him is that the vast majority of his films are adaptations, and he's starred in every single one of his films.
Yes, and I never doubt every time he is in a film, he is putting 110% into it, and I respect that.
He's a true actor.
He is a true actor. Anyway, back to whatever is happening in Condemned. I'm sorry.
Everyone has been told to stay in their homes with lights. And this is actually something that has come up before, but that I think is the emphasis on light is really, really intense. It's interesting because we haven't really, in the past films, this idea of not being able to go in the daylight is pretty standard. We get that in all of them. And that's like very much part of the mythology. But this idea, I don't know if we've had a film where light itself, regardless of if it's coming from the sun, is a protectant, or like wards off vampires.
Well,
and so I thought that was kind of interesting, that it was like, keep your candles lit.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we just have Nosferatu, where Helen reads that the only way for a vampire to be destroyed is by... Well, actually, it's kind of weird. It's like he needs to be distracted by drinking the blood of a pure woman, so he doesn't hear the cock crow, thereby implying that the sun's light will kill him, which it does in the movie. So I think that's the only case where sunlight or light of any capacity has been used to destroy the vampire.
I think that in Mark of the Vampire, you learn that vampires can only be killed during the day, or that's something that's said, is that like vampires are invulnerable at night. The Nosferatu thing is, it's like there's so many layers to it, of like drinking blood from a pure woman like at dawn, so he's distracted, so he doesn't hear the rooster, so that the sun, and it's like, what if it was a cloudy, exactly, what if it was a cloudy day, or like, what if he like stopped drinking, or
what if he like literally just moved away from the open window? Yeah,
or like woman feels. Yeah, it's like, does he have to be in the sun's rays, or like, what is it? And pure woman also feels kind of vague, because like, yes, I think the obvious assumption would be like a virgin,
but she's married, so it's like, I guess pure in the context of she has only been sexual within the bounds of marriage, or
like pure of heart, pure of soul, pure of intentions. Like, what it like? Plenty like of just took a bath. Like,
plenty of sexually adventurous people are pure of heart.
But that's what I mean. That's what I mean. Is like,
it's like, does it
pure?
Exactly.
Yeah, that I would not associate pure with someone's sex life at all. Like,
oh God, I would. I think in 2024, I would hope we as a society do not. But time changes slowly, though. Progress is slow. So going off that train of light and its effect, Marguerite begins to put out the candles, which the professor's like, no, don't do it.
Wait,
but she's
did we say that he goes to the house to see her?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
We did. Yes, the professor's at the house, like I said, to quote unquote release her because of his quote illness. So we see the effects of it, the vampirism coming on. She starts to put out the candle lights because she thinks it's affecting him, which it is. And he's like, no, don't do it. She's like, no, it's okay. She's like, sit by the fire. But, you know, he still transforms. It's too late. And she screams.
Well, she puts out every single light.
She does. It's, okay.
What do you think of that? Because I saw a review where someone was like, this was completely unbelievable, where he's like, the light is what keeps the monster away.
He knows. Yeah, he has this knowledge that that's what affects him, because he knows he's infected. It's really dumb.
And he's begging her not to do it, and it's the like, first time that she's put her foot down or made a decision about anything, where she's like, no, we are blowing out these candles.
we have the fire, it's fine, stop overreacting.
And she says the room is bright as day because of the light of the moon. And it's that's not true.
It's not true. It's like, it makes no sense. And it's like, oh my God, Paul, just say no. Tell her to stop. Like, if you care about her and not wanting to turn into a monster that drinks her blood, like, tell her to leave the candles lit. But that doesn't happen. And Paul transforms, which is kind of equivalent to him just like suddenly making an angry face, and she screams. And, this is when Daniel, like...
Sorry, that's such a hilarious... He makes an angry face. You're so right, though. He really does just, like, furrow his brow and that's, like, it.
But that's enough for her to go, like, he's a monster now. So all kind of the supporting... The Scooby Gang busts in with Daniel, Dr. Bizet, and her dad.
The Scooby Gang.
Yeah, there's always a Scooby Gang in these films that gotta take the vampire down.
That and the mob of stupid villagers.
The mob of stupid villagers, which, appear. And Zahn is there as well. And of course, the mob scapegoats him and chases him in the vampire bat fashion.
He saves Marguerite because he pulls the doctor off of her.
Right.
And so he even attacks Zan too. Like, he has a wound on his throat as well.
Yeah, no, like, again, just, the uncomfortable, ableism, which, I mean, sadly, I think would have been, yes, apparent at the time, is there. And so we chase Zahn, despite Zahn being the one who saved Marguerite. The mob chases him. And this is when, oh my gosh, it is wild, I think. I might have written it down in my notes, but so the mob is chasing Zahn to the caves, and Dr. Bizet is talking to Paul about what happened. Marguerite's okay, she just fainted. And while they're talking, Paul suddenly realizes, wait, they're chasing Zahn. We should go stop them.
Yeah. And there's this really, it might not have been this scene, but there's a really horrible moment just in terms of like people being so suspicious of Zan. And so like, there's a scene where one villager says to another, what good can there be in a hunchback? Because one person is like, well, the professor takes care of him. He lives with the professor. Like, there must be a reason that the professor thinks he's good. And then the person responds and says, like, what good can there be in a hunchback? And it's like a really fucked up moment and a really, you're right, like a very brutally ableist thing to say and believe.
I mean, that's a good way to put it. It is brutally ableist. I don't know if, like, again, because we don't know what time period this movie takes place in. If it's further in the
ambiguous
past,
time of some people are dressed kind of like German, like little villagers, and then German, other people are in their three-piece suits.
Yeah, no, exactly. But so it's like, I don't know, for an audience in 1935, would that have also been seen as ableist as well? I don't know, because again, we don't know what time period this film takes place in. But regardless, brutally ableist. And it's very sad. And we are chasing Zahn, and like I said, just the professor suddenly being like, you know what? I think this is actually the scene where Bizet tells the professor about the vampirism and his mother. It is,
yeah.
Oh, okay. So then, if that's the case, then the professor is not aware.
No, he doesn't. So what happens is that when they have the conversation by the fire, they kind of have a conversation that acknowledges that these spells of like memory loss and fatigue, and when he passes out, like that these spells like do align with the deaths that are happening, that it is suspicious that but basically like the result of that conversation is that they both agree that that he can't marry Marguerite until his malady is cured. And that's how they really refer to it, as like a malady, an illness, a sickness, which I think ties into some of the things that you've touched on in terms of this being a sympathetic vampire story. But then the attack on Marguerite happens, the crowd chases Zan away, and the Dr. Daddy Friend is like, I will tell you the full story. Like, I will give you the full context.
Gotcha. Yes. So with this full context, Paul and Dr. Bizet just now realize that maybe they should go help Zahn. So they arrive at the caves, and the professor confesses to the murders despite Zahn protesting and just...
Well, David arrives first.
David arrives first, that's right. And Zahn is just very ride or die.
His devotion is so intense, but this is... I also wanted to rewind just like a couple seconds before then, just because I was really shocked by... So they chase him to the cave. He's kind of hiding around a corner. They're all there, and the villagers start to talk about like what they're going to do with him. And it is so graphic. Like they... they talk about like beating him to death. They talk about beheading him and putting a head on his spike. They talk about trapping him in a cage and putting him in the town square so they can watch him starve to death. They talk about hanging him publicly in the square and leaving his body there. Like they really, and it's different people kind of being like, what if we did this? What if we did this? Like a town hall meeting. And it is so, I think it's some of the most violent dialogue we've had so far, and some of the most like violent implications that we've had. And then David shows up and he's like, this isn't right. Like Zan isn't involved in this. Like it's clearly not him. It doesn't make sense. And then he says, it's the doctor. And then the townspeople freak out and they're like, you're in league with him. Like, you're the fiend's servant. Like, you're helping protect Zan. And Zan is definitely the monster. And then you're right that then the doctor shows up. Yeah. And he's like, Zan is innocent. They don't believe him. He shows them the wound on Zan's neck. And then he's like, you're right. He's like, the monster is I think is what he says. So you're right that then he reveals himself.
So he reveals himself. And then the professor proceeds to kill himself by jumping over the edge of the cliff. And
inside the cave. It's a cliff inside a cave.
Sure, why not? And Zahn follows. And the doctor says to Marguerite and Paul, like, you both are... Or not Paul, Marguerite and David... You both are free and safe. The evil is gone. And the breeding pair go forth unfettered. End film.
Yeah, and then it just ends.
And then it just ends. It's like very similar to Bela Lugosi. Both Dracula. Again, we have had so many vampire films where the couple just kind of walks away. And then
Vampire also ended that way?
Yeah, the breeding pair goes forth.
Yeah. Well,
that was Condemned to Live.
Yes. And they actually say that in, I think this is our first example of the title of the film appearing in the, because when Dr. Bizet is telling Paul the full story, he's like, your mother was bitten and then a day later you were born, condemned to live.
Which, I'm not gonna lie, that's a cool line.
It was. I was like, oh, nice. Like it was actually not that corny at all to have it included.
Condemned to live.
Yes. Condemned.
Condemned to live.
Yes.
But so all right. I know you said you liked this one a lot more. I did not so much, mainly because I think it was just as a film, it's pretty mid, not very good in terms of some of the acting, much of the dialogue being very sort of clunky or hokey or on the nose, and just a lot in terms of the directing. Yeah. And how I guess unstylish or unpolished it seems, but I know there's certainly stuff that can be said in praise of the narrative or what it was doing in terms of the theme of vampires and vampirism.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that artistically, when you look at the formal elements of the film, there's nothing impressive. It's very stage-like. The camera sits in one place. The framing is like the characters are all at the center of the frame. It could very easily have been a play. And, so there's not much going on with the cinematography, not much going on with the editing. I think there was only one moment of like visual interest where the professor is reading at his desk and it kind of zooms in on the candle sitting there, and then the candle like burns out and is like complete, there's no wax left, and then it zooms back out and it's dark and the professor is like asleep on the desk. Like that's the only time that something interesting happened with the camera. So like you're right that when you look at like the technical and formal elements of the film, there's really not much going on. But yeah, I think in terms of, it just occurred to another plot hole just occurred to me. Because now that we're talking about it, I'm seeing some gaps in the story here, or things that don't really make sense. Because when Bizet is like telling the story to Paul, one thing that Paul is like, how has this not, like, why is this just now happening? Like, have I been doing this the whole time? Like, have I been killing people the whole time? And he's like, no, you were totally normal your whole life. Now it's just because you're exhausted and overworked that, like, you're having these spells because, like, your body is not, like, I guess you don't have enough energy to, like, naturally resist the temptation to blood. And so then, and him working really hard is a theme from the very beginning of the film. Like, I will say that they established that he is a very selfless person and is constantly doing everything for everyone. Like, there's a scene where a little girl is like, read my homework, and he's like, yeah, I'll do it right away. And then, like,
he does.
So, yeah, and he does.
It's like,
so yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely what I do with my students when they ask, grading it first thing.
Yeah. And just for this random little girl when he has all these things going on. But so that raises the question of, like, when he kills himself, it's like, bro, just take a vacation and, like, cut back on your work hours. Killing yourself just seems, and obviously, yes, he's committed several murders, but he didn't even remember them.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think we're still in this period of time where, if you commit murder, gosh, your soul sure is damned or whatever, or it's just like you're done morally as a person.
Yeah. Tara coming out pro-murder. I know, like, that's not what you're saying.
God forbid a man have a hobby.
But it's true that there are situations where, like, I've seen incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people talk about how, like, in prison, murder is not actually, like, the thing that will get you ostracized. And, that, like, because there's self-defense and, like, sometimes it's, sometimes self-defense is genuine. Obviously, when it comes to, like, stand your ground laws, like, those are, people claim self-defense, and it's like, no, you just wanted to kill a person of color. Or, like, you just wanted to kill someone who, like, came into your driveway to do a K-turn. So I think that happened in the past year. 3 people were shot and killed because they were lost and they backed into a driveway so they could turn around, and someone came out with a shotgun and killed them. But I have seen people talk about how, like, there are quote unquote worse sins than murder, in community, in prison communities and things.
Yeah, the one that always gets you ostracized is typically, if you abuse a child in any way, or crimes like sexual assault, like those are
abusing helpless people, I think is, or like elder abuse. I think that those are typically the things that will really kind of get you, like, a bad reputation and that people won't want to associate with you. And I think probably also really wealthy people doing shitty things that harm others. They're in the nice prisons. Yeah. Or like Jeffrey Epstein was probably, like, in solitary for a reason,
Yeah, no, I mean, I know that's there's the very common conspiracy theory that he did not commit suicide, but I remember I was watching a video with one person. They just said, if he was smart, he probably did kill himself.
I think that there's some suspicious stuff of, like, the security footage being mysteriously deleted, and the fact that, like, he seemed pretty staunchly invested in maintaining his innocence and stuff.
I mean, yes, I do agree with that. It's
quite convenient.
Elliot coming out, Epstein did not kill himself. I'm just saying, it's not, like, beyond the pale that he would have done that. Like, that's the most unfathomable thing. It's like, I mean, no, like, we're just saying in prison he would not have been popular.
No, they're equally likely. But I think you're right that that this is like the first film that isn't like you're damned for all eternity, you're like truly evil and irredeemable and like a monster. Like you're right that this is the first time that there's some acknowledgement of, you know, that he's a person, and they never call him a vampire. That's one thing that I noticed, was that people call the townspeople refer to the monster. And then when it comes to like conversations with Paul, like a lot of times like they call it like his illness or his malady, like I was saying. And even when they've acknowledged, like even in the conversation with Bizet where they've like fully like aired it out that he is the person committing these murders, he says like, what will happen to me? And he says, if we don't find a cure, you will be overtaken by this madness. Like you will be consumed by this madness. And I thought that was a really interesting way of like, no one ever says you're going to become a vampire.
Yeah. There is an interesting trend of euphemistic language around it, I think. And yes, we're still very much in the, you know, if I have vampirism, just kill. Like better to not live than to live as a creature of the night, because we're a long way from vampirism being seen as something that's cool or liberatory or like a higher state of being. Or even
or something that you can, higher state of being is interesting, or something that you can kind of live alongside, like that you don't have to like jump off a cliff inside a cave.
No, exactly. But it does. It is the first film we've watched where the vampire is, because I think, you know what? I think our last actual on-screen vampire was Vampire, because after that we have the Vampire Bat, which there's no vampire. We have Mark of the Vampire, no vampires technically.
Yeah.
So,
which is so that honestly, like,
that's wild. That was back to back.
It is really interesting that it was back to back, and also like, Mark of the Vampire does not hold up to any scrutiny when it comes to the idea that like they're actors, because I remember you pointed out where you were like, she turns into a bat. And so does Count. Yeah, so does Count Mora, like played by Lugosi. Like you also see him turn into a bat, and it's like
they were that committed to their craft.
Yeah, no one's that good.
But yeah, no, this is the first film where we've had the vampire be the main character, and
yeah, you're right.
We as the audience are familiar with who they are and their humanity, and how it affects them to learn that they are a vampire and have committed these murders. So yeah, no, kudos to the movie for that.
Yeah, I think that's really, and that's one of the things that I liked about it, was that I thought that was genuinely really creative. And definitely because I think our last two films, I know that Mark of the Vampire also came out in 1935. And I think that maybe the Vampire Bat was 34. I can't remember for sure, but even just in the period of like the same year, we have a film that has like a totally different interpretation of, you know, and even the idea that vampirism is like an illness that can be passed down is like, that's not real science. But you know, like, but just the idea that it could be something that's like genetically passed from like mother to child in utero, you know.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, because we have seen the vampirism being genetically passed down through pregnancy in stories before, but it's one of the less common ones as opposed to simply being bitten and transformed. And I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on that being a way to vampirism?
That's interesting. Do you mean before this film, or just like before we watched this film? Because like things like Twilight,
just in general, just in general, in terms of vampire mythology.
I think the idea of a vampire baby is really funny. How does it? because it's like, is the baby like strong enough to hunt for itself? Or it's like, I'm guessing that it's like a thing where like the mom, like, is there breast milk in that situation, or is there just blood?
Ooh.
Like, it raises questions. But yeah,
It
I think the
does.
idea of it is interesting to have that as the idea, because one mainstay or like consistent element is that being turned into a vampire is traumatizing. Like, even
Yes.
vampires that really like being vampires, they
Like,
remember it being traumatizing.
Like,
and even if it was
Lestat has like one of the most traumatizing
and he
vampire
really likes it.
transformations.
He's like, this is the best.
Yeah.
So it is like, there is kind of, you're losing that element of like the tragic backstory and like the terrible event that happens of, you know, like True Blood. Oh God, I can't believe that I'm forgetting her name, but the redhead.
Suki? Oh,
no, is her name Karen? No.
That works at Merlot's with them. The
yeah,
redhead?
she becomes the redhead.
Oh, I know who you're talking about. What is her name?
Oh, Jesus.
I forget, but I know who you're talking about.
Maybe it is Karen. I don't know. I can't remember. But anyway, like her, like the trauma of her turning is a major plot point for Bill and for her.
Oh no. Jessica.
Yeah. So
I'm thinking of the human lady with red hair who's really bigoted against vampires and marries
her.
Terry. Oh, her and Terry.
Yes, but Karen's turning is a big plot point for her,
Jessica.
but also for Bill.
Karen, oh, you know Jessica. What? It's Daredevil. You're thinking of. She was in Daredevil.
That's right, because she plays a woman named Karen, Daredevil.
Yes,
what an amazing part, and she's a great actress. Deborah,
she is
Ann Wool.
Deborah, yes.
And, where
is she?
She's very talented.
I demand she get more parts.
Yeah, she does D&D stuff. She just released her own like D&D campaign or book or something. But
that's cool.
Anyway, so like, and then Bill's turning is also like very much a big part of the story, like his relationship with his maker.
Honestly, Eric had a relatively okay transformation. He was about to die anyway.
But at the time he was like, are you the devil? Are you a demon?
Oh yeah, like
he was like, he would have fought if he could have.
True.
Yeah.
No, I think that's a good point, is like so much of vampirism or the trope or the figure of the vampire is so tied into this idea of them having a tragic or traumatic transformation from human into vampire, because that's still very much ingrained within the mythos, which is like becoming a vampire is bad.
It's
or
being
like,
murdered. Like you have to get killed.
You die, and then you have to essentially, you do have to murder afterwards. Not always, but
yeah. So it's sort of funny imagining someone who was like born into vampirism, kind of like trying to become friends with other, like in adulthood, trying to become friends with other vampires, and there's like they're at the bar and like everyone's like, talking about like the nightmares that they have. And then he's like, like just always been this way. Grew up in a vampire family,
Just always had the craving.
And he's like, I don't have any tragic backstory, you know?
Yeah, you have like Louie and Bill in the corner like, we're monsters.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh my
God. You know what also just occurred to me is that that a vampire that was born a vampire would never be able to miss the sun, which is such a core aspect of our idea of vampires now, that they would have never seen the sun. So they wouldn't be able to feel that loss. Because one of the big themes as well is that vampires are like, yes, I gained immortality. Yes, I gained strength, but I lost the sun. I lost, I lost like all of these other things that are like aspects of being a human. So that's really that you've actually raised that. I thought that was just kind of a silly question, but now that I'm like, no, silly questions are good. But now that I'm really thinking about it, that actually raises some really interesting questions, like cultural differences between like born and turned vampires.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That is fascinating. Like, yeah, what kind of life is Renesmee going to have?
Well, she can go in the sun. It doesn't
that's true.
affect
It's
her.
just, I don't know.
But she's not going to be able to relate to other vampires very well when it comes to.
Yeah, but yeah, that's interesting. But yeah, the cultural experience of being born a vampire versus becoming one.
Yes. Yeah.
Born or married into it.
Yeah. I guess it is sort of like that's a lot more common in werewolf stuff, where there is, I think it's a lot more common to have an idea that there are some werewolves that are, born into werewolf families. They're like of werewolf bloodlines. And then there's like werewolves that are given the bite,
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I think there is more of that in werewolf mythology. Yeah, so did we have any... Oh, I know you said there was a bit of maybe some queer subtext with the professor and
homoeroticism.
Foster daddy and friend.
Yeah. Well, I think that the relationship between Paul and Zan is really interesting because Paul seems very devoted to Zan. They go everywhere together, and Zan is like so deeply and intensely devoted to Paul. Like when the villagers all storm in after Marguerite is attacked, like multiple people are like saying like it doesn't make sense for it to be Zan, and then they ask him directly. And he doesn't defend himself. He says that he didn't see the monster, that he doesn't know. And then he runs away, which seems like a pretty big kind of admission of guilt. But the thing that kind of struck me was, and maybe I'm just like reading into it, but the thing that kind of struck me was like, they have this really intense embrace, when the professor arrives, when Paul arrives to the cave and he's like, Zan is innocent. He goes up to him and he shows people Zan's neck. He just kind of grabs his clothes and pulls them to the side. And he leaves his arm around Zan. And then Zan, like they're hugging each other really tightly for the rest of the scene. And then,
interesting.
Yeah. And then the professor, and he's like saying like, no, like, don't, like, it's me, I'm the monster, even while the professor is trying to like take responsibility, and take accountability for it. Like Zan is like, no, don't do that. And then when the professor throws himself over the edge of the cliff or sinkhole or like ravine or whatever it is, Zan is like, no, he screams and he runs after the professor and throws himself over the edge. And that just seemed like a lot of characters have talked about love and what love is throughout the course of the film. And that Marguerite is like actually in love with David and has confused the feelings that she has for the professor, like the kind of idolatry that she has for the professor for love. And it's kind of like, it kind of raises the question of like, Zan seems to have very intense feelings for the professor.
Yes.
And it's like there is some degree of like, maybe it's the same thing as Marguerite, where maybe Zan thinks that he loves the professor, but really he's just like idolizing him. Or there's also the aspect that like, clearly this town is not a safe place for Zan. He might feel that he's indebted to the professor for taking him into his home and keeping him safe. But their relationship is, to me, one of the more, you could read it as maybe one of the more loving ones, because multiple times we see Paul defend Zan to others, even to Marguerite, where Marguerite kind of gasps and recoils from Zan. And then he leaves the room and he's like, you shouldn't have done that. Like, you shouldn't have reacted to him that way. Like, beauty is something that's on the inside, I think he says. Is like, beauty of the body is like irrelevant. Like, true beauty is like inside yourself. So their relationship is just interesting to me. And it's one of the things that if this film was longer than an hour and 5 minutes, I would have like scenes devoted to their relationship and to seeing how they are when they're alone with each other, because presumably they do spend a lot of time alone with each other, but we never actually see that.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. And I can definitely see that perspective with their relationship. I guess with my initial question, I was thinking more of the professor and doctor, the other doctor that comes in.
Oh.
I mean, there can be more than one.
Yeah, they can it could be the whole polycule. They seem close. I didn't really get like a gay vibe. I didn't get a gay vibe from no, but I didn't get I definitely got that they were really important to each other. I think I did get a bit of and the foster father thing just continues to be perplexing because they really look like so similar in age.
They do, but again, I don't think time matters in this film because the professor's 1 year old.
Yes. One going on 45.
Time works weird in this one.
But I think that there is something to be like a lot of the films we've watched, the relationships are so one note, you know, where it's like, this is my dad. He tells me what to do. This is my fiance. He tells me that he loves me and that he wants me to be safe. Like, this is my friend. We hang out together and I'm sad when she gets murdered. Like, you know, like it's
very on the nose.
Yeah. It's very surface level. Yeah. But those were kind of some of the things that I found kind of interesting. And it's like, because the censorship is so weird, the hug between Zan and the professor is so much more like intense than like any of the hugs we've seen between Marguerite and David. You know, where like they're really like gripping each other. You know, you can see the imprints they're making in each other's clothes.
Yeah, you could argue a codependent relationship.
That's true. You could absolutely argue that. Yeah. But when we see Marguerite and David together, like they sit close to each other and I think they smooch each other once, but it's pretty passionless.
Yeah.
I wonder when we're going to get to passion.
Yes. It's like, when are we going to have a heterosexual passion?
Yes. When are they going to have like ardor for each other? You know, when is that going to be allowed is the question.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's very much the 1930s of come here, sweetheart. And like planting, like they do those like hard smack kisses.
They
it's
do. Like, where they're they really are like pressing their faces together briefly.
Well, and also like because of the Hays Code, there was like specific kinds of kissing and for specific lengths that you could do it for, all that stuff.
No French kissing, no tongue.
That didn't exist in 1935.
They didn't know what that was.
Of course not. It's French. We're in America.
Yeah, that's funny.
Yeah, so I think those are about all my thoughts on the film. Did you have any other ones?
No, I mean, another pretty quiet film. We didn't really have much in the way of music except like the kind of the racism about the drums at the start of the film.
That was interesting. And apparently, if IMDb is to be believed, it's the same music from the Vampire Bat, but I can't really. That
actually makes a lot of sense because I remember being like, this feels kind of familiar. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. Actually, speaking of sound, there was one other moment where I thought that the drums were coming back because there was this kind of thumping sound. Yeah, like when Marguerite got attacked. And then I thought it was meant to be like heart beating, like a heartbeat.
I don't recall that.
I honestly think it might have been like some sort of mistake or some sort of like there was some bumping of the mic or something that happened during shooting, because the version that I saw on Amazon Prime, there were some like stutters. I wouldn't call them full jump cuts, but there were some scenes where it was clear that they'd lost a few frames. So there was like a few times where a character stuttered or like moved weirdly. And then there were also a few scenes where like this big kind of scratch or artifact would appear in the right-hand upper corner of the frame, where like clearly there'd been some damage to the reel of some kind. So it's also possible that that was just kind of shoddy production and that they couldn't really do anything about it in the edit. But yeah, another sign of what you were saying in terms of like the kind of lower, but they were an indie production. They were doing the best they could. Yeah,
it's true. It's true. Condemned to Live is an indie film.
Art house cinema. Yeah. Well, I guess there's all that's left is just like picking a favorite moment or significant moment.
Favorite moment.
The end. Like when it was over.
Oh my god.
Well, I guess, do you want to say anything about why you didn't like it so much? I guess you kind of have. But.
Yeah, just for the reasons I've outlined. I think while it's cool that it was an outlier for the time, or it was progressive in the sense of how it depicts the vampire sympathetic and the vampire is the main character, I don't think it wasn't really enough to save it for me in terms of just the technical aspects and a very kind of clunky script and very one-dimensional characters. But
yeah, all fair and true assessments.
And in terms of favorite moments, I guess I like the shots on the beach by the cave. I think there was one where Zahn was holding one of the professor's victims, maybe, or someone was carrying a body
on the beach. I must have missed
shot.
That. Okay.
Oh, yeah, it was artistic. I liked it.
Okay. Cool. I think my favorite moment was not a moment. I think that Professor Kristen's, like Paul's, the actor who played Paul, I liked his performance.
Yeah.
There were some moments where like when he realizes that when Bizet tells him the whole story and like how he's the one that's been committing these crimes, like he kind of expresses some like anguish that I felt that I kind of believed, so I thought that, like in terms of acting and stuff, there isn't much to say. So I think he stood out to me as like the best actor.
Yeah. 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 No, I would agree. He was good. He was one of the better parts of the movie. All right.
He's a little bit sexy. I liked his beard.
Yeah.
I don't know.
The beard was nice. He rocked that goatee.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to another episode of This Podcast Sucks.
Find us where you get your podcasts on Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube. Follow us on social media and give us a like.
You can find us at That Vampire Pod on Twitter and Instagram. We'd love to hear from you guys. And remember, stay bloodthirsty.
Catch our next episode on Lambert Hillier's Dracula's Daughter.